So let me start from your childhood that you wrote an article at the age of 10 about the spread of fascism. It is very astonished for me that when I knew this information at that early age that you knew about it. So what was the meaning of fascism for you at that time and how do you define it?
Well, the article is very easy to date. It was written after a particular event. The event was the fall of Barcelona, Spain, to the fascist forces. And it was about the article was about the spread of fascism through Europe. It started with the fall of Austria, Czechoslovakia, Toledo in Spain, Barcelona. Fall of Barcelona was basically the end of Spanish independence. It fell to Franco at that point. And it looked at that time to me and to people around me as if the spread of fascism was inexorable, that it was just not going to stop. I, of course, didn't know it at that time, but later when US archives came out, it turned out that US planners had about the same impression. They were then thinking about already planning for a post-war world. This was February 1939, just on the eve of the war. But planners were thinking about it. And for several years, until about 1943, they assumed that the war would end with a division of the world between a German-held Eurasia and a US-held world, which would be the Western Hemisphere and the former British Empire. That continued until Stalingrad, and it was a huge tank battle in Kursk in 1943, in which the Russians destroyed a large part of the German army. And it became pretty clear by that point that Russia would defeat Germany. And then plans changed, but for the post-war world. So it was a very frightening prospect. That was the pessimism. I assumed that the United States would find ways to overcome it, but that's the way things looked at that time. If you can wait 1 minute, I can move to a better computer.
Sure, please feel free.
Okay, let's go on.
Okay, so next question on a lighter note, I want to ask that what is your day-to-day life? I'm asking this question because you have interest in so many things and you are involved in so many things. So how do you manage your time starting from morning to night?
I don't manage it. Ever since the pandemic, I've always had a very intense schedule, but since the pandemic, it's increased enormously because people all over the world recognize that we can basically have a discussion. They don't have to invite me to travel to Kolkata or Nepal or South Africa, wherever it is. So it's a lot of talks and interviews and a lot of ongoing work, classes online. So it's pretty constant.
Thank you. So you are called the father of modern linguist. And who inspired you to become a linguist?
Well, actually, I knew a little bit about the field indirectly as a child. My father was a Hebrew scholar. I actually read his doctoral dissertation when I was maybe 11 or 12. It was a dissertation on medieval Hebrew grammarian, famous grammarian, and he had material in it on historical Semitic linguistics. I had a little, and we talked about it, of course, and I had some childhood experience, but then happened more or less by accident. I was actually, when I got to college, I was 16 years old. And first year I was there was very boring. I was thinking of dropping out, but I happened to meet a very significant figure, Zillick Harris. I met him through political contacts, actually, shared political interests, and he suggested that I take his graduate courses in linguistics, which I had no background for, but he gave me a manuscript of a book that he had just completed, which is the basic text for modern structural linguistics. And I read through it, got interested, took his courses, started taking some other graduate. I never really had an undergraduate education. I just started taking a scattering of graduate courses from some of the really outstanding figures at the university. So it was a very eclectic kind of, some in philosophy, some in math, some in other things, anthropology, Arabic I was studying, and it just fell together.
Thank you, Professor. Now coming back to the political aspects of your life, you were in the enemy list of President Nixon. Do you think that at that time it influenced you, or it somehow made you scared of expressing your free thoughts and free intellectual ideas, like somebody from the government is probably keeping eye on you?
Well, not from the enemies list. That was a joke. But in fact, friends of mine were envious because they weren't on it, But there were serious things going on. I was actually facing a possible long prison sentence for involvement in resistance activities that could have happened. If you recall, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in January 1968, it convinced the U.S. government that that the war was not going to be winnable, and they started moving. Just a second. Oh, that's good. They started moving towards negotiations and cutting back the war, and they canceled the trials. I was scheduled to have a federal trial in a couple of months, but they were canceled. It was fairly serious at the time. I was seriously engaged in resistance activities, quite publicly, nothing secret about it. The idea, in fact, was to make it as public as possible. So, and there was one trial. I was a co-defendant and one was to be charged in the next. But the enemies list was just a silly joke.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I was reading the list and on Wikipedia, and there were many famous names. So I was thinking that because what is happening in India, in my opinion, that government is keeping eyes, and if we talk, even being a student, we can be in jail for UAPA, unlawful prevention activities law, and which is
in India, it's very serious because of the nature of the government, highly repressive government, which is clearly dedicated to dismantling Indian secular democracy, which has been a kind of a model for the world since independence. It's now under serious attack. Modi plainly wants to construct a Hindu ethnocracy, which would have little resemblance to a democratic society. I should say that's happening in the United States as well, which is very serious. If it happens in the United States, the whole world is affected because of US power. And it's very serious in the United States.
Yes, in India, one of the things is happening now, that the right-wing people, they have problem with the word secularism because it is in our constitution, it was amended later. So they prefer to call it more like pluralism. So for me, basically, it doesn't. I mean, in practice, there is not huge difference between two words. So what do you think that why people have problem with the word secularism?
Well, if state power is under the control of a democratic public, that's one thing. Right now in India, the effort to turn India into a ethnocracy, a Hindu ethnocracy, unfortunately has plenty of popular support from the Hindu majority. And that's the threat. If, Modi is not all powerful, it's quite striking to see the victory of the farmers in the farmers' strike. That's a major achievement. But nevertheless, the Hindu extremism is raging in India, and that's a very dangerous phenomenon. It's reminiscent of the fascist countries in the 1930s, which I was writing about and frightened about as a child.
Thank you. I'll come back to this topic in a while, where want to talk about farmer protest in India. But before, I want to just ask one question on a lighter note, that you visited Kolkata, my city, in 2001, and Calcutta University conferred you the title Doctor of Literature. And in your speech, you said that you are very happy to accept this honor from the land where your subject was developed. Basically, you mentioned about Panini's grammar. Um, how was that trip? Like, did you enjoy? Because I want to recall that there is a recent documentary, and one professor of Calcutta University said that in our country we don't have Professor Chomsky, we don't have Jean Paul Sartre, we don't have Pablo Neruda. So we are actually missing a lot of intellectual discussion. So that's why I want to know that how was your trip?
Well, there have been and still are outstanding intellectual figures in India. You can mention Tagore, for example. One of the things I did when I was visiting Calcutta, was then Calcutta, not Kolkata, was visiting Rabindranath Tagore's university, which was a very interesting experience, still functioning. But there are outstanding figures in India. There always have been. It's a remarkable intellectual class. I've visited India a number of times, usually Delhi, sometimes Kerala, most of the country, and it's very exciting country. In fact, just in my own field in linguistics, there are outstanding people in India, including Kolkata. So I don't think it's correct that to say that there's no international intellectuals. There are plenty. Some of them actually have left the country because of concerns over what's happening there.
Yes, thank you. So do you think that how Indian literature and philosophy influence you in your research or your writings? Do you have any particular point you would like to mention?
Well, I followed as closely as I could the Indian struggle for independence. Many great figures. Tagore was an influence in my life. In later years, actually, I learned about the Indian linguistic tradition and philosophical tradition fairly early on. Turned out that I didn't know it at the time, but the kind of work I was beginning in linguistics in the early 1950s had some similarities unknown at the time to the Indian, classical Indian grammatical tradition. Panini's work was somewhat similar, and actually in a book that my colleague Morris Halley and I wrote on structure of English, we ended with a reference to Panini just to bring up the connection. It's and I learned more about it later, but it is a very rich tradition.
Okay, now I want to go into the next segment as I discussed, that is the language and death of a language. So particularly, I am a little bit worried about the future of my mother tongue Bengali, because in city Kolkata, many people prefer to speak in English or even in Hindi. So I just want to ask in a general way that when does a language die?
Well, it dies when people give up on it, decide not to speak it. I don't think it's likely to happen with Bengali. It's a major language. Incidentally, there's fine linguists working on it in Kolkata. My friend Prabal Dasgupta, who you may know, is an outstanding linguist in Kolkata, who's doing lots of work on Bengali. And the language is live, spoken uh, literature, spoken in the rural areas. I don't think it's in any, there's any prospect of its dying. But many languages are dying. Aboriginal languages, many of them, but even in Europe. So if you go to a country like Italy, you can find many people who simply can't talk to their grandmothers because the language of their grandmother has virtually disappeared. Uh, Italy, as in Europe, as the countries developed national states and national cultures, they also developed national languages. So if you go back 50 or 60 years, there were many places in Germany where people didn't speak standard German. Go back 50 years before that in France, French was a second language for many people. Actually, there are even places in the United States where that's true. I've given talks in universities in Appalachia where the local dialect is almost unintelligible. Students in the university are basically taught standard English as almost a second language. If they want to get jobs in the general culture, they're going to have to know English. So it's a process that takes place. All of this means disappearance of languages. In the United States, territorial United States, there were many hundreds of languages. They've almost all been wiped out by violence as the people were exterminated or expelled. Same thing happened in Australia. There are efforts now, finally, to protect and in some cases even to revive Aboriginal indigenous languages that have been where the people and culture have been suppressed or destroyed. But I don't think Bengali is a likely case.
Thank you. Yes, so I am asking this particular question because this government also kind of trying to impose the Hindi language to other regional states. For example, the people from southern India, they don't speak in Hindi, but they wanted to kind of popularize this Hindi and take initiatives to force them to learn it to some extent. Now, in my simple question is that Bengali is also one of the most spoken language in the world, probably sixth or seventh, if I'm not wrong. Now, my point is that if I impose or authority impose one language on another and kind of force them to speak or to use it for official work, My point is its usefulness probably will decrease with the time. So what are the parameters that decide that, as I said, that the death of a language, or how we can try to stop it and resist it, and also we can keep it alive for a long time? Because I don't think that if we only use it for the literature, we will somehow get disconnected from the common people. So what do you think about this?
Well, you know better than I do, but I think, as far as I'm aware, the common people in West Bengal speak Bengali. They don't speak Hindi. I visited Panchayat out in the countryside. Nobody spoke Hindi. They didn't even know it. It's the common language. And if the intellectual educated classes continue to use it as a language of literature and high culture, they'll enrich the common culture and the common language. It shouldn't be. I understand that the central government, as part of its general program of pursuing a Hindutva policy, will try to suppress the native languages, but I doubt that they'll be able to do it. Indian society is too rich and vibrant for that to happen. Maybe over time, long time, but that'll depend on political and social developments.
Yes, I think so. This is the optimistic part. So on the general note, I want to ask that how our consciousness is related to speaking a particular language. For example, that the animals also communicate with each other, that even they don't speak a language. So do you think that our consciousness clearly decide or try to help us to phrase a particular sentence in a certain way so that it is understood by a wide range of people?
Well, it's very important to have a mode of communication that reaches many people. There was a time when in Europe, the language of science, philosophy, literature was Latin. By the 17th century, the vernaculars, the local languages, began to be languages of literature and culture. So Descartes was writing in French, which was an innovation. In later years, English became a kind of international language, but that's just because of British and American political and military power. If China becomes a major power in the world, Chinese will become an international language. In fact, it's already happening. So I taught most of my life at MIT till recently. When I got there in 1950s, students, graduate students in engineering, math, and so on, had to study French and German because prior to the Second World War, most of the scientific literature was in French and German. Well, that changed. By now, lots of graduate students are studying Chinese because an increasing amount of literature at the scientific literature, technical literatures coming out in Chinese. And that may also become a language of commerce and interchange. These are reflections of national power. They don't have anything to do with the language, of course. And it's an international version of what's happened in countries individually. So as I say, in the European countries, as the nation states were established, the national languages followed. By now, just about every young person in Italy speaks Italian. That wasn't true 50 years ago. They spoke many different languages. The languages are called dialects, but they're really different languages. And these are, as far as the consciousness and cultural awareness is concerned, it is very much tied up with a language, the native language that you speak and you master. That's a repository of cultural wealth, of oral tradition, of historical memory, and so on. So when a language disappears, a lot disappears with it.
Yes, following this question, that being a student of science, I would like to ask that we always write research papers in English. Do you think that we should popularize science in our mother tongue? Do you think that it can have an extra effect to communicate with people?
Well, the science is an international enterprise, and scientists from various parts of the world have to interact. That's why 70 years ago, students at MIT, probably Cornell, were studying French and German. You wanted to be part of the international scientific culture, you had to read French and German. That changed. Now it's English mostly, for some Chinese, but that's a necessity. Now, in an interconnected world, it's a very good idea for people to have a multilingual capacity. I don't actually, and I feel the loss, but it's an enriching experience to be able to easily enter into other cultures and interact with people who are part of that culture. So that's just part of general awareness of the richness and variety of the cultural wealth of the world. Part of it is learning other languages.
But in your university days, you wanted to learn Arabic and then you did not succeed. So what was the story behind it?
Well, I did know Arabic pretty well enough to be able to read newspapers, to read books, Arabic literature, not very fluently, but I could read with a dictionary. I didn't use the knowledge and it disappeared. That was 70 years ago. If you don't keep your knowledge of a second language alive, it just disappears. That's even true for first languages to some extent.
So you have extended your moral support to the farmer protest in India, and now it's a successful protest because the government has repealed 3 farm laws. Now, many people are saying that this is a shame for democracy. But in my opinion, the protest is also a part of the democracy. So how do you see that people are saying that, okay, then anybody can protest and the government will repeal the laws, everything will be decided by protest. But on the other hand, we believe also in our Supreme Court has said that a common citizen has right to protest, and this is a part of democracy. How do you see these two things?
Well, the right to peacefully assemble and protest is a fundamental element of democratic, the functioning of an actually a democracy that's alive and well. It's a central part. Actually, it's guaranteed in the US Constitution. It's guaranteed in the practice of other democratic societies. So, and the farmers' protest was a quite remarkable example of that. It wasn't just going out and demonstrating for one day in Washington. It was a year-long difficult protest under much duress and attacks, but the farmers withstood them and demanded their rights. Farmers have suffered severely since the neoliberal programs were instituted back in the 90s. Farmers' suicides have skyrocketed. The systems that were in place to assist the poor agricultural population were eliminated. Rural research areas, support systems, and so on. Part of the neoliberal program was to concentrate wealth and power and diminish the role of the general population. And farmers did suffer severely. And these new laws that Modi was planning to pass would have increased the monopolization, centralization of control of agriculture. Actually, India has real problems coming. Punjab, main agricultural center, is facing severe problems of environmental destruction, potential droughts, so on. That'll be a very severe problem for India. In fact, altogether, South Asia is one of the most endangered victims of climate change. If current trends continue, South Asia will be almost unlivable in a couple of decades. I mean, already I think about a year ago, in Rajasthan, temperatures rose to 50 degrees centigrade. In a rich country, you can survive that with extensive air conditioning and so on. Not in a poor state like Rajasthan. People simply won't be able to survive.
So this is an interesting question which arose in my mind. So what should be the proper language of a protest? Because in some cases that even the two protests have the same cause or same goals, but because of the communication from the leadership to the protesters, one protest may lead to a successful one and another is not. So do you think that we should analyze the language of the protest or the like how they are communicating to fight against the common cause?
Well, there's no general answer to this question. Depends very much on circumstances. But the language of protest should be designed so that it brings people to understand and react sympathetically to your demands and positions. And it should not be formulated in such a way that it can be used as a way of attacking and undermining what you're trying to achieve. We saw examples of that in the United States very recently. So after the George Floyd murder, there were enormous protests. And one of the slogans that was selected was defund the police. Well, actually that meant something very serious and constructive. What it meant was shift police work to real police work. And when there are issues that can be dealt with much better by community service activities, don't hand them over to the police. So drug overdoses, family disputes, and so on. Those are problems for community services, not for the police. That's what it meant, but it was immediately distorted by the right wing into the pretense that it was a call for eliminating police. And that was used by Trump, the right wing generally, as a way to demonize the protests and delegitimize them. That's the kind of thing that happens if you don't choose your language carefully. It can turn into a weapon for your enemies. They're going to try to crush the protests. and you don't want to give them weapons. So you have to be careful in how you choose your actions, your wording, the way you approach people, and so on. That's a general part of serious political action.
Thank you. And another thing, particularly in our days, what we feel about the media is not a positive one. So you wrote the book Media Control in 1991, before my birth, actually. And nowadays, if we see that there is a bias opinion which they are broadcasting over television debate and everything, it somehow makes us feel like somebody is attacking us with a hammer on our head and putting biased information and trying to convince us. Do you think that due to this biased opinion around us, the independent intellectual thoughts are not generating in a proper way, or they are it is basically getting narrowed down so far?
Well, the media are in real trouble in most countries. So in the United States, for example, there were, if you go back 30 or 40 years, there were quite good, very good local media in cities in the United States. In Boston, where I lived, the Boston Globe was a serious newspaper, had a national bureau in Washington, had some of the best reporters on Central American issues, had maybe the best reporting in the country, had foreign bureaus. Actually, the editor was a friend. I knew many of the journalists. Plenty of flaws, but it was an important newspaper. Now it's hardly worth reading. It just has wire services and local news. Same has happened around the country. Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Detroit Free Press, local newspapers, which were quality newspapers, have disappeared. The national press is basically down to two newspapers, New York Times and the Washington Post. Nobody else even has bureaus in Washington. And international news, you're pretty much down to the New York Times. And they, the big newspapers themselves, have declined because they've lost advertising to the internet. So there's a serious, and there's another crisis. New media have developed on the internet, which are not, they're open far-right propaganda organs, like Fox News, which is Fox Cable News, which is the most watched cable, barely qualifies as a news source. As a source of far-right propaganda. It hardly conceals it. And that's reaching huge numbers of people. The media have their problems, they have their flaws, they should be pointed out, but they nevertheless, the major media, remain the major source of fairly reliable information about the world. And the attacks on them from the right, condemnation of them as simply, propaganda organs of liberals, has a devastating effect on democratic functioning. You see it all over the place. So take the anti-vax movement in the United States, enormous movement, which is undermining the efforts to deal with the COVID crisis. It's just circulating all kind of crazed lunatic theories, which are reaching enormous numbers of people and having a very harmful effect on the society. That's why hospitals are being crushed by unvaccinated patients to the extent where they have to cancel regular procedures. Enormous social cost. Large part of that is what comes out of the right-wing media, which have no interest in truth and accuracy and are simply organs of right-wing political extremism. I'm sure this is true elsewhere as well. That is, we see it all over. So the media, we should be critical. I continue to be of the flaws and distortions in the mainstream media, but should also recognize that they remain the most reliable source of relatively serious coverage of the world. The attacks on them from the right are a very serious phenomenon, which are another attack on functioning democracy. And democracy is in very serious danger, not just in India.
Yes, I wanted to ask the same question that in your book, What Uncle Sam Really Wants, you have written that common people can protest by demonstrations, writing letters, and voting. But in present day situation, I think the voting is the most effective one, but there are also corruptions associated with it. But do you think at this moment there are other avenues which we can use to express our views? For example, one thing is that social media, so that we can express our opinion freely.
Well, social media have like other technology, they're basically neutral. You can use them to inform people, to organize, to develop understanding, political action, or you can use them to undermine thought, to spread rumors, conspiracies, to drive people into bubbles where they never hear anything except self-reinforcing, often wildly false pictures of the world. Social media are available for all of those things. Depends how you use them. The means of protest are not just a large part of serious protest is organizing, putting together, bringing people together so that they can develop their thinking, their understanding, act collectively to achieve goals. Protests come from organization. In the past, the labor movement was a major source of carrying forward constructive social objectives. That's one of the reasons why the neoliberal leaders, Reagan, Thatcher, their first acts were to attack labor unions, to try to prevent people from having an ability to defend themselves against the neoliberal assault that they were planning. And reviving the labor movement will be is a crucial element in trying to carry forward moves towards a more just and fair society. So there are lots of ways to act. The right ones to use depend on the existing circumstances. Lots of possibilities. We don't live yet in fascist states. And I stress the word yet because we're moving in that direction.
When you look into the future, probably after 100 years, because there are people have submit themselves to different ideologies, and then they don't support the ideology anymore. But now we are, as you mentioned, that we are living kind of a era of neoliberalism. But when you look into the future, do you think that there can be another ideology, or according to your opinion, that what do you see that which ideology people will trust more in the future?
Well, if the neoliberal assault continues unabated, then there won't be any future, because one of its core elements is driving the world towards catastrophic ends. One aspect of it is maximizing the use of fossil fuels and cutting back the measures to mitigate their use. And that's a death sentence. And it's being pursued constantly. The major lobbying group in the United States, American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, major lobbying group, business lobbies, supported by a wide range of corporations, has now launched a new program to try to force states to withhold funds from banks and other institutions that respond to shareholder concerns about reducing fossil fuels. They want to protect the fossil fuel industries and their commitment to destroy human life on Earth. That's the world that we're facing, okay? If the Republicans come back to power in the United States, that'll be state policy, as it was during the 4 Trump years. Race as fast as possible toward the precipice and eliminate methods, devices, rules for limiting, controlling the damage. Because we have to enrich the very rich in the near future. That's neoliberalism. All kind of fancy rhetoric about markets, but it's all garbage. It's basically class war. It's class, and you can see it in the consequences. So if that remains, we're essentially finished. Okay, it's as simple as that. So therefore, we have to ensure that it doesn't remain, and that the forces that are seeking a more just, fair, survivable world, that those forces are in the ascendant and dominate. That's a crucial task, never risen before in human history. And lots of problems in human history, a lot of crises, lots of horrors, but we never faced the problem of disappearance of organized human life on Earth, and we now are. And the right wing is pressing very hard to achieve that goal. That's the fact of the world that we're living in. With that.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask just last simple question in 1 minute, because now if you look back in your past, and what is your greatest achievement you consider that made you proud? And is there something that you wanted to achieve but could not get it?
That's a topic for another couple of hours of discussion.
Okay.
They pick simple things out.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
For the university even. But afterwards, let's talk about it.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Very good to talk to you.
Very good to talk to you.